Engine, who is the CEO of Alberta Electric System Operator, will be presenting on behalf of Sector 10. And Aaron is certainly a trooper because he is giving this prior to joining. He'll be the new representative starting for Sector 10 in February. So we may have other Sector 10 reps on that will come alongside Aaron, but let's go ahead and turn it over to Aaron. Let me make sure I can hear you, Aaron.
Can you hear me okay then, Jennifer?
Yes, very well. The floor is
Perfect.
yours, sir.
Appreciate that. And I'm clearly the new person on the block here. I've been at the Alberta ISO for 7 months now, and had been on the board for a number of years prior to taking on this role after having retired from investment banking after 25 years. And as I sit here this morning, all I can think of is what a difference a year makes. Some of the panelists were chatting a bit about weather and what it's like in the east, I think in particular, where it looks like it's going to be chilly. And I'm sitting here in Calgary, Alberta, enjoying a very balmy 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And when I say what a difference a year makes, on this day 1 year ago, it was not plus 40, it was indeed 80 degrees colder. It was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And we were looking around the province at the time and looking perilously down the barrel of rolling outages across the province. We just didn't have enough supply. Wind had stopped blowing, sunshine had been leaving, and we were not able to draw on energy from our neighbors. So it's a much nicer time to be jumping on a call like this. So I appreciate everyone's time. So if we can go to the next slide, Jennifer. High level, the things I want to talk a little bit about is what are the independent system operators? What do they do? What are the regional transmission organizations? And talk a little bit about the council, which is call it a collaboration amongst the ISOs and RTOs across North America. You'll see the actual composition. There are 2 ISOs in Canada and a number of RTOs and ISOs in the States. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the emerging trends that we're facing across North America. And we won't get into the details of how we're trying to solve them, but we'll certainly talk about some of the emerging trends. So Jennifer, you can go to page 4. There we go, thanks. So number one, ISOs and RTOs are not-for-profit entities. Our costs, RTOs and ISOs, generally recoup their costs through transmission costs, through transmission rates. And the key thing that we are involved in is wide area infrastructure planning and balancing supply and demand across the grid. And some of the things that we're thinking about as we do that is how do we adapt to extreme weather, how do we manage affordability, and how do we integrate new technologies into system operations. And as I'm thinking about extreme weather, as I say, what a difference a year makes. It was quite a scramble last year when the temperatures turned very cold, but that's not new in the US either. Think of Elliott in the US Northeast and Uri in ERCOT in recent times. And as amongst all the ISOs and RTOs, we try to learn from those experiences and how to apply best practices and try to avoid some of the challenges that our grids face in light of those wild fluctuations in weather. On the next page, what are some of the functions and benefits of the ISOs and the RTOs? Well, number one, we provide non-discriminatory access to the transmission system for generators, for large power consumers, load. The generators are able to connect following a connection process, and it's through an application to the ISO or RTO. And this non-discriminatory open access process facilitates competition amongst generators. It facilitates the competition among resources and ideally leads to more competition and more competitive prices for consumers. And that's all built on the back of, and why that's unique from many other jurisdictions across the US and indeed elsewhere, is that in North America, we went through in the 80s and 90s, the electricity sector, the electricity industry, went through a period of deregulation. And the ISOs were formed in the US after the issuance of FERC orders 888 and 889. And the idea was to encourage utilities to work together to ensure they had non-discriminatory access to their transmission lines for non-utility owned generators. Here in Alberta, we went through that process in the year 2000. So it's been about 25 years for us since we went through deregulation. And the RTOs perform generally the same functions as the ISOs, but have jurisdiction over larger geographical areas across multiple states and provinces. And when I look across North America, generally speaking, ISOs and RTOs serve about 2/3 of large power customers in the US and in Canada. So in addition to providing that non-discriminatory open access, which was necessary when we came through deregulation, the ISOs and RTOs also are a platform for the wholesale energy and capacity markets. And how those energy markets and capacity markets function vary greatly across the ISOs and RTOs. In Alberta, we actually don't have a capacity market. Some of the ISOs and RTOs in the States do. The whole idea behind having these markets, though, is to incentivize cost-effective and efficient dispatch of a generation, and to try and encourage new supply investment. When you have market-based prices for energy and capacity, the hope that we all have and the balancing act we all have is wanting to see strong enough pricing to incent investment in generation, but not prices that are so high that induce high costs or limit affordability in our jurisdictions. The third thing we do is we perform the system operations through those markets. And generally speaking, the structure or the reason for doing that is to look at least cost dispatch for energy and to try and address reliability needs at the same time. Generally speaking, dispatch of energy in those jurisdictions is based on some form of least cost to highest cost generation. And then lastly, the ISOs and RTOs are engaged in long-term transmission planning and resource adequacy work to make sure that the grid is growing out in a way to be able to manage one of two things: growth in generation and growth in load. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the big growth that we see in load coming forward. And the reason for doing that, the raison d'etre for doing that, is to make sure that we have reliability on a long-term basis, and that's through assuring that we have proper transmission and that we have proper delivery of energy on a reliable basis. On the next page, it's equally important to understand what the ISOs and RTOs do not do. One of the reasons we are called independent system operators is that we do not have an economic interest in any of the assets over which we have a management control and operation. So ISOs and RTOs do not own power plants. Our market participants do. The ISOs and RTOs do not own transmission lines or substations. Those are again by the market participants, transmission facility owners. And then lastly, ISOs and RTOs do not have retail customers. Those retail customers are all owned either at the transmission level by large owners or alternatively distribution companies who are connected to the grid. So on the next page, or 2 pages on, I'll go to page 8, give you an overview of who the ISOs and RTOs in North America. There are 9 ISOs and RTOs, and they're all indicated on the map. And as I mentioned, they serve about 2/3 of the large power consumers in the US and more than half in Canada. The remainder of the grid is mostly managed by vertically integrated utilities that operate their transmission facilities. The 7 ISOs, RTOs in the US are Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland Interconnect, PJM, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, California ISO, CAISO, the New York ISO, NISO, Southwest Power Pool, SPP, and ISO New England in the US. And there are, as I said, 2 ISOs in Canada, one in Ontario, the Ontario Independent Electric System Operator, and then the Alberta Electric System Operator. And interestingly, the jurisdiction for MISO, Mid-Continent ISO, extends into the Canadian province of Manitoba. So on the next page, page 9, the ISOs and RTOs formed an industry-wide collaborative. We call it the ISO RTO Council, the IRC. It was formed in 2003, so just a few years for us in Alberta after we became completely deregulated. And as I mentioned, the whole purpose behind it was to share innovative ideas and best practices. Organizations that have faced challenges with respect to grid reliability, supply adequacy, and challenges in operating the grid in face of major challenges, and then try to share that information. One of the great examples is there were a lot of learnings that came out of Uri in ERCOT. It was fascinating to see the experience in Texas, and all these little Canadians up here were really smug. It's cold up here 8 months of the year. We know how to run cold systems. And sure enough, 1 year ago, almost to the day, -40, we had valves freezing off. We had derates on gas-fired plants. We had access to transportation access problems around gas. We did take some learnings. I don't think we were serious enough about it out of the ERCOT experience. But we do try to share those ideas and best practices. The IRC also looks to develop joint or consensus positions on important regulatory or legislative matters. The group meets quarterly, and the chairperson rotates annually, and then effectively serves as the primary point of contact and the chief chairperson. Currently, the chairperson is Gord Van Wiley, the president and CEO of the ISO in New England. Interestingly, today he and I were sharing emails. We are going through here in Alberta a complete rewrite of our Alberta market design and transmission policy. And to give you a good example of how the IRC works, I had a really good conversation with Gord about 3 months ago about some of the virtues and vicissitudes of locational marginal pricing. We're trying to think about whether we want to do something like that in Alberta. He told me how effective it can be in his jurisdiction. Our government has said, no, we won't do it. And we were just chatting more about that again today. So there's great benefit that comes out of being part of this council. On the next page, what areas does the IRC cover? Again, all of the ISO and RTOs, and what do we do collectively? Well, the organization effectively operates through committees, the first one being the executive committee, and that's comprised of the CEOs of the 9 ISOs and RTOs. We have a planning committee which shares expertise and advice on system planning functions, practices, and activities across North America, and looks to develop consensus positions on important regulatory policy proposals. The second committee is our operations committee. It shares, again, expertise and advice. This time, rather than system planning, it's about system operations, functions, practices, and activities, and once again tries to develop consensus positions on important regulatory proposals. The next committee we have is the Standards Review Committee. That committee participates in the design and development of methods, standards, procedures across the ISOs and RTOs. We have a communications committee. No surprise, it serves an internal and external voice of the IRC to try and build awareness of what's going on, to share best practices among the organizations. No organization like this would be complete without an information technology committee. Here across the platforms, and particularly helpful to us right now as we go through market design, we are able to consult with other ISOs and learn from them what is their experience on IT and the kinds of platforms that are necessary to run an energy market. In our case, we're going from a real-time energy-only market into a day-ahead market for both energy and capacity, coupled with a real-time energy market in Alberta. And so the opportunity to be able to go to other ISOs and RTOs and ask, what's your experience? Where have you seen problems? Who are good service providers has proven invaluable to our jurisdiction. There's a regulatory and legislative committee as well, shares information on those issues connected with legislation and regulation. There are some common interest areas, and so consequently, we will from time to time coordinate joint efforts on regulatory policy proposals. And then lastly is the Markets Committee, and that committee is responsible for the areas of potential electric market standardization and communicates design ideas to the Standards Review Committee, which then coordinates and builds policy positions in North America. So some of the emerging trends on page 12. A couple of really interesting things that we get that we've been doing some work on. Of course, demand growth, and those are largely driven by of more recent times electrification of transportation. So many more of us are driving EVs, not anything like Norway. I think in Norway, penetration now on new car sales is pushing through to 95% of all vehicles sold are EVs. But nevertheless, with growing penetration of EVs in North America, we have to know how to manage that demand growth. And as well, one of the new topics is large loads, in particular AI data centers, which can come with great opportunity, but at the same time, great cost for the grid. Many of parties, including ISOs and RTOs, are looking for ways to be able to understand the reliability that are posed by large loads and what mitigation, if any, do we need to have in respect of planning and operating on the grid, broadly speaking. We're also facing more and more work around electric and gas coordination efforts, focused in particular around winter, reliability and resilience. In an environment where most space heating is driven by natural gas, there is a bit of a trade-off between the electric industry and those that are just consumers of nat gas for space heating. And that is, of course, that sometimes depending on transportation capacity, we may have to be making choices between where do you want the gas to go? Do you want it to go into space heating and natural gas, typical consumers of methane, or do you want it for power generation? There's strong arguments for both. And more particularly as well, how do you design tariffs, both in terms of service and cost of service, to ensure you have natural gas available in those hours when it can get very cold in Canada and the U.S. Northeast and elsewhere. We're also facing a lot of growth around variable resources, in particular wind turbines and solar. They have absolute impacts on operations, market design, and planning. As I'm sure you all know, those assets are intermittent forms of generation. And so when I look at a grid and see 1,000 megawatts of wind or 1,000 megawatts of solar, as a system operator, I have to be able to make plans to be able to ensure that there's energy available in those hours when those intermittent resources are not available. And we're seeing significant growth in storage. Costs have been coming down on battery technology in particular. I'm sure many of you heard of Tesla battery packs. They're popping up all over North America. They can do some tremendous things to firm up the grid, make it more reliable, provide many ancillary services necessary to ensure the grid is reliable, and can manage some of the ramping characteristics, ramping challenges that we have when wind and solar are coming off. In the case of solar, when a cloud comes over or the sun goes down, or in the case of wind, when frankly the wind just dies down. We're also facing a lot of challenges around dispatchable resource retirements. Those are principally coal-fired generation and older, less efficient natural gas-fired generation. It's pretty tough to realize, for a lot of people to realize just how important those kinds of assets are to maintain a stable and reliable grid. It's those kinds of resources, when, as I say, when we need them, they can be there. Sometimes they have to have a little bit of nose to do that. But as they get decommissioned for economic reasons, largely speaking, we have to ensure that we're making up that supply with a mix of, generally, a mix of intermittent resources, whether it's wind and solar, batteries, or other forms of natural gas-fired generation. Much work is being done in this region to do natural gas-fired generation with emissions abated with carbon capture and sequestration. And although there's been much discussion around carbon capture and sequestration, it still remains quite expensive to do and largely economic without the benefits of some form of government support or incentives. And then the last thing that we see a lot of is the work that has to be done across North America to try and incorporate state and provincial policy initiatives into markets. Legislators are very focused on cost and reliability, and it's not unusual for the ISOs and RTOs, when working with policymakers, to see that legislators, lawmakers don't understand the trade-offs. Most people want to have very, very high reliability, I'll say 99% plus, but want to pay for reliability that looks more like 50%. And there are trade-offs, and we have to be able to work with lawmakers to help them understand what those trade-offs are, and that's part of what the IRC does. So markets continue to evolve in accordance with public policy, and as I say, we're doing just that here in Alberta, but we're not the only ones. Ours is a holus bolus 100% transformation of the market and grid policy, but all the jurisdictions across North America are looking at changes to one degree or another.